Audi, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche. These cars have made Germany famous for automotive engineering, and they are fast and powerful enough for these equally famous German roads, which are unlike any other in the world. The Autobahn, a national highway system with no top speed limit. If you love cars, chances are driving the Autobahn as fast as you can is one of the things you want to do before you die.
Being able to actually put your vehicle to the test and really show its full potential is the ultimate.
Everything about the Autobahn owes a lot to Germany's unique and difficult history.
So there's this kind of bizarre Cold War moment when German lawmakers argue that being a free citizen, somebody who is not living in a totalitarian dictatorship, has to be able to drive as fast as they want.
That's an interesting choice, is that you can be able to drive as fast as you want. I'm interested to see what they're going to say about this. I think I would generally be worried, like, in America, I don't know if I've seen driving or drivers to be that good ubiquitously that I would be trusting all of these people to be able to drive as fast as they possibly wanted. Presumably, if there was no limit, then maybe it wouldn't even encourage people to drive a particular speed. That could also be another alternative, is certain people will want to drive faster and some people want to drive slower. But that does seem fairly dangerous, especially considering vehicle accidents is like a pretty serious cause of mortality in at least America, and especially things that are related to like alcohol or other substance intake while driving sounds really bad. So that being combined with a drive as fast as you want location sounds like a recipe for disaster, but there might be something mitigating this risk. Maybe they have different laws or stricter procedures around like driver's licensing or something like that. So I'm curious to hear what they're going to say about this.
So why doesn't the US, or any other country in the world, have an Autobahn? And is it really all it's cracked up to be? First things first, what is the Autobahn? The full name is actually Bundesautobahn, which simply means federal highway. It is a more than 8,000-mile system of limited-access freeways that run all throughout Germany. The word Autobahn is often just translated as motorway. In simple design terms, it's quite similar to freeways in the United States. Limited access means cars and trucks only. No pedestrians, no bicycles, no skateboards, nothing other than cars. There are designated entry and exit points and no stoplights or intersections. The roots of the Autobahn go back all the way to the early 20th century, but really, the first big step in its growth happened under Adolf Hitler. There really was no need for it at all. Few Germans owned cars. Most took public transit, which was plenty fast and got people to where they needed to go. The Autobahn's real potential was as propaganda.
They want to build a sort of a futuristic mega project, something that would lend itself to, talking about the regime as a modern, forward-looking regime. At the same time, while it was, politically speaking, a very repressive, totalitarian dictatorship, right? It was about symbolizing power, the conquest of space.
By the end of World War II, there were less than 4,000 kilometers built, about 2,500 miles. It was really from the 1960s through the 80s that the Autobahn system we know today was properly developed.
This was obviously a time when the Federal Republic became sort of an affluent Western liberal democracy and also much more of a consumer society. So people actually began to own cars in much higher numbers.
The post-World War II era is also when the Autobahn gained its most famous trait: long stretches with no speed limits. During the Nazi era, the speed limits were mainly to conserve fuel for the war effort.
The birth of a new free nation for Germany.
Once West Germany became independent and separate from the Communist East in 1949, it kept the Nazi-era speed limits for a few years. But then,
in a really astonishing move, the Federal Parliament in 1952 decides to abolish all speed limits, not just on the Autobahn, but on
Wow, that's a pretty bold move.
any kind of highway and in urban areas as well. And you can imagine the results, especially in cities, right? With cars going as fast as they want.
Crashes, injuries, and fatalities all rose until the government started reinstating limits on roads.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was referencing earlier, which is I don't think I'd trust the average human being to just do whatever they want with a vehicle that can go really, really fast and potentially endanger other people's lives. Like, I think this is something that we do struggle with in America for some things. Like, a potentially controversial topic is like masking in COVID times. Like, this is something that people disagreed with, or at least from my understanding, disagreed with on one side of it sort of limited their personal freedoms, and that was like one side of the debate to my understanding. And then the other side of the debate to my understanding is, but it is for the benefit of others who are not for you. And so if everyone acts in a selfish manner, then collectively we can be worse off. But there is still the other side of, but it does limit your personal freedoms. And so where is the line between allowing personal freedom versus the greater good? And so this is where for cars, this is particularly dangerous. And like I said, accidents happen all the time with speed limits. So I can only imagine without speed limits that this would increase. So it seems like they're referencing that this is exactly what happened.
It mostly left the Autobahn alone. Mostly. Today, speed is regulated on about 40% of the motorways. Some limits are fixed, others are dynamic, changing according to conditions. On the rest of the freeway, the recommended speed limit is about 80 miles per hour. That means if you get into a crash at a speed above that, you can be held liable for the accident.
My parents commute regularly from Nuremberg to Munich, and my mom will drive 100 miles an hour, and it's not a big deal.
It's not that unusual to just travel somewhere at 200 kilometers an hour, which is around 125 miles an hour. But all things considered, on average, I would say it's probably best to imagine Autobahn traffic somewhat like driving through Texas, maybe, or through Kansas. People don't drive slow. It's quite fast all the way around, but it's not recklessly fast. It's not race car fast.
German race car driver Rudolf Caracciola is still believed to hold the record for the fastest speed ever recorded on the Autobahn, 268.8 miles per hour. But others have come quite close, such as a Bugatti Chiron that hit 257 in 2021.
So I have driven a BMW B7. It's an Alpina 600 horsepower sedan. I drove that 170 on the Autobahn. That's the fastest I've driven. It was difficult to do, by the way.
I'd rather not talk about the fastest I went, even though it's legal to do so. Let's just say I once went 4 towns away from us by accident. I didn't want to go that far, but I was just going a little too quickly.
German automakers don't necessarily make their cars specifically for the Autobahn, but the demands of high-speed environments like these highways do influence their engineering decisions and marketing. Mercedes refers to their car.
That makes sense. Even as they said, basically the average, I think they highlighted around 81 miles per hour being the average. And obviously in the US, hopefully on a standard highway, which has a speed limit of about 65 miles per hour, that's around the average. Hopefully for every person who's going above that, there's somebody who's slightly under. And so while those numbers aren't that far apart, that could be a noticeable difference in going from 65 to 80 plus as your standard speed. You might notice the performance at going at these higher speeds, generally speaking, especially since a good amount of driving, as most Americans are probably familiar with, is usually around the city or like a mix of city and out of city. Most people likely because of their commute. Rarely would you be on a full stretch of highway for so long that you could just purely go at a pretty high speed unless you're going on a pretty big trip, which is likely a very rare occasion unless you're like a truck driver or something, which again, I hope you're not especially going fast with a truck, which would be more dangerous and heavy and likely and prone to danger. And so I could see a push for performance and control and some of that experience of driving at this high speed if that's a standard within your country and your standard commute.
Cars as Autobahn proven.
Driving at high speed is not a video game. It should be relaxed cruising. Yeah? And the big challenge for us is controlling the energy in the car which increases with the square of speed. And that becomes very important at speeds over about, I would say, 60 miles per hour.
It starts with aerodynamic designs, but axles, suspension systems, springs, dampers, roll bars, the tires, the braking systems are all tuned to perform at this level.
We tune the vehicle safety, the comfort and agility, yes, to deliver a typical Mercedes-Benz driving character at high speeds.
Mercedes even has an onboard system designed to keep the car on course when it is hit from the side by a strong gust of wind.
Even with startling events like, for example, powerful wind gusts. So our aim is to keep the car stable and safely on course at high speed without permanent steering corrections, while damping out bothersome chassis motions. And the car will always support the driver by being tolerant of mistakes.
To understand why Germany is basically the only country in the world with a mostly unregulated highway like this, it is probably best to look at what makes Germany's driving laws and car culture so different from, say, the supposedly freedom-loving United States. First of all, it's a lot harder to drive a car in general in Germany. You can't get a license in the country until the age of 18. In the US, the law varies, but in most states, people can obtain learner's permits at 15 and receive licenses allowing them to drive legally under at least some conditions by the age of 16. It is also far more expensive and challenging to obtain a license. Many hours of instruction are required and the tests are demanding.
It's much more difficult, it's more expensive. A lot of people fail their driving test.
That makes sense. I had also referenced this earlier, which is our testing for driving is probably a little too lax in America, to the point where there's obvious issues with how some people drive well after years and years of their driving, and you can see it on the streets of some of this poor behavior on a fairly regular basis, especially if you're in an urban area. And so it does make sense to me that you would have to offset that freedom with some level of responsibility and some barrier to entry.
Myself included.
Fees for a license and all of the associated instruction in Germany can run 2,500 to 3,500 euros when you add.
Wow, that's quite a bit. I'm not remembering the exact reference here, but I think some previous times euros, sometimes a little bit higher than the US. I'm just going to say $3,000 to $4,000 is probably the range. I think for a US driver's license, I'm not sure anymore nowadays since I didn't just recently get my license, but I would probably guess like not even $200 to get your driver's license here. So certainly a fraction of the cost.
Add up the costs. The fee for a driver's license in the state of California is $45, but
wow, $45. $200 was clearly too much of an exaggeration. $45 is so cheap.
that state, as is common in the US, requires driver education classes as well. Then, the certification process for your car in the country is also extremely stringent.
I had to get my 500 euro minivan through it. It was not easy. And that sort of makes the Autobahn feel safer. You know you're surrounded by cars that have been rigorously checked. A lot of cars here in the States, especially in the Rust Belt, would probably not be fit for the Autobahn.
Having such barriers in the US would really limit the number of people and cars who can drive in a country that is right now far more car dependent than Germany is. Americans drive about twice as much as Germans.
Germany is a much more urbanized country. There's lots of people who live in major cities who don't even have a driver's license. They get around using public transit and use rail.
Then there is the cost of this. A lot of engineering goes into keeping these motorways drivable at these speeds. The pavement is extremely smooth and is more or less constantly maintained. That's expensive. The German government spends 5 times more on the Autobahn than it does on its other federal highways.
If you look at the average American freeway or interstate, you will usually just find concrete surfaces. And in Germany, it's way more intricate than that. You can drive through the pouring rain on modern strips of Autobahn that were recently redone, and you don't have any spray whatsoever. You can travel at very high speeds through the pouring rain, and that is no issue at all.
Though the US population is far larger than Germany's, building up a highway system that could realistically handle such high speeds would require much investment. And US infrastructure suffers both criticism and financial insecurity. The thing is, Tracy says, Americans might not be missing as much as they think they are.
I have found that the reality is just, it's a little bit anticlimactic in a way. It's just not quite what you want it to be.
Just because there is no speed limit doesn't mean you will always be able to drive fast.
Yeah, that makes sense. Presumably, traffic does still exist, and so you can't just go as fast as you humanly want, because there's going to inevitably be another car there, likely. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. Also, like 80 miles per hour as a standard speed. Definitely, being an American, I've observed people drive 80 plus on a highway, even though that's not the speed limit, and they get away with it perfectly fine, and for them, it's a normal occurrence. And so it's not like Americans aren't driving at this speed. The distinction is it's frowned upon and that you could get in trouble for doing it, whereas it seems like it is actually legal here in Germany to do so and also even go faster. But again, I'm sure there's Americans who have driven faster than 80 on a highway at some point if no one was there to stop them. And so I'm sure that does exist, but just with traffic alone, that's not possible in all conditions.
Across Germany, there were about 516,000 traffic jams in a single year. And the number of hours Germans spend in traffic has been rising. Several highways had traffic jams that were longer than 40 miles.
It's under construction a lot. It makes sense. If you have an unrestricted highway, it has to be perfect. You can't have a deep pothole like in Detroit where I used to live. If you had one of those potholes on the Autobahn, you'd see cars getting air.
Germany's Autobahns are also major thoroughfares for international commerce.
Germany is kind of right smack dab in the center there of Europe. It's sort of this connector between East and West, even North and South. So you see a lot of commerce. A lot of trucks are traveling on that Autobahn, and they are not fast.
If you come to Germany and expect a large and vast countryside and you can go wherever as fast as you like, then you might get disappointed because it's quite crowded and we have large cities.
The absence of speed limits on German motorways divides even German opinion. Polls have shown that a slight majority of Germans favor introducing a hard limit on the Autobahn for safety reasons and to help the country hit environmental goals. Speed does worsen the severity of crashes and raises the risks of injuries and
Of course, that should be pretty obvious, which is force is mass times acceleration. So basically, the faster you're trying to go, the harder it is that you're going to hit something. And so this is pretty obvious to me. I assume it's obvious to everybody. A car that's going really, really fast is going to cause a lot more damage, especially to that human, than it is if it's going slowly. I think we all have observed this with cars in the past.
deaths. That said, most of Germany's vehicle fatalities happen on rural roads, followed by urban ones. The share of motorway fatalities is also smaller than those in some other OECD countries, such as Slovenia, Luxembourg, and Belgium.
I guess there's studies supporting each side of that argument, but the numbers don't lie. You don't have much differences in fuel consumption, for example. It just doesn't make a whole lot of difference to drive 130 kilometers per hour or keep it open. And you also have to consider the fact that we don't always travel at full speed all the time.
There are also strict rules. The left lane is for passing. Unlike highways in many other countries, you cannot pass on the right. If someone is behind you in the left lane, you have to move over. Tailgating is a serious offense that comes with heavy fines.
It's also for everybody a high responsibility. So that's why we are not allowed to pass on the right lane. You have to also adapt your speed.
Statistically speaking, Autobahns are safer than other roads, but that mostly has to do with the fact that there's only cars and only trucks. I mean, there are people who literally are afraid to drive on the Autobahn because of the lack of a speed limit.
In like manner, the data on how much introducing a speed limit would reduce carbon pollution has met with skepticism, though some recent numbers suggest it might be more than previously believed.
Anybody who owns an electric car will tell you, when they go fast on the highway, their range plummets. BMW i3, which was developed right there in Munich. And that car, I can drive it in the city and I'll go 180 miles in the city on a charge. But on the freeway, I'll do 115.
So in many ways, Americans...
That was also a weird comparison for electric vehicles, mostly because I'm pretty sure electric vehicles also have a function where they recharge based off of braking. And so in a city, you're going to do more braking, and so you're going to get a little bit more recharge out of that and basically conserve your energy as you're going through versus a location that you're not. So I don't know if that's the only reason, but do agree that there are different conditions and vehicles will behave differently, especially electric vehicles.
Envious of these German speedways might be missing out on a bit of fun, but it might also be true they are envious of something that is more myth than reality.
I think a lot of Americans probably would travel to Germany. They'd get a fast car and they'd say, woo-hoo-hoo, let's do it. And then they'd be stuck behind a truck in traffic and they'd be like, what the heck's going on? It is not a racetrack, but every now and then, the right stretch of the Autobahn and the right time of day and the right car, you can reach automotive nirvana.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.